Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to be continuing looking at analyzing African philosophy, looking at what is Akan philosophical psychology. Now, we are going to remain in West Africa. Last time we were looking at Yoruba epistemology, but now we're going to move a little bit west and look at the Akan people, a meta-ethnic group comprising several ethnic groups originating in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, but having since spread to a lot of the neighboring countries. These include groups like the Twi peoples that arguably themselves comprise a set of ethnic groups, and the Twis may be a broader meta-ethnic group as well, but that's within the broad group of the Akan, and as well as many other groups that fit in that category. This video focuses on the Akan concept of personhood and personhood around morality, and how personhood has been argued to be distinct from being human. Being a person and being a human may be different things, depending on the view that you have about this. There are two prominent philosophers that have done the kind of ethno-philosophical work to translate these oral traditions into philosophical terminology. Kwame Gyekye and Kwasi Wiredu. I promise you I pronounced those wrong, but don't worry, go watch others of my videos. I pronounce everything wrong. These two philosophers present different accounts of these concepts, and we're going to cover them both here. We'll start with Wiredu. Wiredu argues that for the Akan, there is a distinction between being a human and being a person. Being a human is guaranteed by biology, but being a person requires a capacity for rationality and can be increased in degree through or lost without taking actions that take care of and show empathy with others, particularly those one has a relationship with. So, in order to go from just being a human to being a full person, you need to be rational, so your choices are being rationally made, and you need to have a certain level of morality in this very communal sense. So you need to take care of those that you have a relationship towards or you have a responsibility towards. You become more of a person the more people you take care of, particularly outside of that kind of subset of who you should be taking care of your family or your neighbors or your community, and you become less of a person if you're not taking care of those people that you should be taking care of. The reason this distinction is important is that it really is about moral status for Wiredu. For someone to have moral status, they need to be a person. For someone to be the kind of person that you need to behave ethically towards, you need to behave rationally and have this kind of respect for your communal relationships. Now, Wiredu has some interesting things here because he has a couple levels of moral status. Just by being a human, you get a certain level of moral status, but to achieve that higher level of moral status and even build it up by degrees in terms of the amount of kind of respect and moral onus on someone acting towards you, you need to have that rationality in those relationships towards others. Gyekye is going to go the other direction. He's going to say that this isn't about moral status. He's going to have the same basic tenets of, yes, kind of relationships with others and honoring those relationships is important, but he's going to more frame it in terms of you being a more or less virtuous person, kind of in line with virtue ethics, as opposed to you having moral status or being a full person or not. So in other words, someone that cares for a great many people and goes above and beyond the call of duty would be more of a person than someone that only fulfills their basic responsibilities to their family and neighbors. The person that cares for people beyond their immediate community who they don't have those necessary relationships with, they're more of a person. They're a better person. They've moved kind of above and beyond personhood. To meet the bare minimum of personhood, you have to care for those people with which you have those important relationships. So your family, your neighbors, your community, those kinds of things. And that person in turn would be more of a person than someone that didn't take care of those people with which they had a relationship or those responsibilities. The central idea here is that you can gain or lose moral status based on your actions towards others. The more you care for and support others, and the more people that you support, the more of a person you are. If you're solely individualistic and only think of yourself, there's a way in which you are not a full person, and therefore do not have moral status. In this way, moral status is akin to status within a community. the more people respect you because you have supported and helped them, the more of a person you really are. Whereas the less people respect you because you've taken advantage of them, the less of a person you are. This is used in many ways to kind of deal with issues of collective action failures, where if everyone works together, you could accomplish a task, but no one individual person has an individualistic incentive to participate in that task. If you have social norms like this around that of people being considered less of a person by not participating in those communal activities, whether that's harvesting a field or building a building for the communal society, the stronger those bonds are going to be and the less of kind of a collective action problem you'll have from an economist sense. This can also provide an explanation for society taking retribution in the form of justice against those that fail to support or care for their families, as those people have in an important way lost part of their moral status. Now, I say part of their moral status because Wiredu does think that humans at a baseline have a certain level of respect that they deserve in moral status, but that there's a higher level of moral status that comes with personhood. And this can be unsettling because infants, under this conclusion, aren't fully persons because they don't have a capacity for rationality, and they can't make those rational choices, and they can't support others. However, Wiredu argues that infants have moral status in virtue of being humans, just a lower level than adults, who have capacity for rationality and morality. Wiredu supports this interpretation through cultural practices around infant death. When an infant dies, there's no funeral in Akan culture. According to Wiredu, a person has not died in this sense. Since the infant never achieved personhood, there's no soul that needs to be ushered into the afterlife. Now, there's some interesting Akan kind of traditional religious views around reincarnation of souls that haven't had the opportunity to fully achieve personhood and all of that stuff. And the exact conception of soul doesn't perfectly map onto Western definitions, at least according to Wiredu. Gyekye is going to say that it maps much better onto that. Wiredu is going to say, it doesn't perfectly work like that. It doesn't match exactly. It takes more of that kind of rationality and moral agency in some way. And the Akan are going to believe that those young souls that didn't have a chance to form into souls might be reborn again and have another opportunity to go through that process and make it to a good afterlife. Something like that. But that's just some broad strokes to give you a sense of why this position might be convincing to the Akan of saying that an infant isn't necessarily a full person and so doesn't get a funeral right. Now, Gyekye is going to be on the other side of this. He denies this conception of personhood, claiming that all humans are people, infants included, and that that's the correct interpretation of kind of the Akan traditions. He claims that this concept is much closer to the idea of a soul, which is immaterial and provides individuals with moral status on the basis just of them being humans. He also argues that failing to accomplish your duty for caring for others does subtract from your status as a person. It subtracts from your status in terms of morality, but it doesn't take away the fact that you are a person or have moral status. He argues rather that it makes you a bad person. He says that not fulfilling these responsibilities you have to your community, once again in a similar way to what Wiredu is talking about, simply means that you're not virtuous in an important way. And there's a lot of connections between kind of Akan philosophical psychology and the moral system and things that look like virtue ethics, because you talk a lot about whether or not someone's a good person as opposed to whether or not a particular action is good or bad. This account is less convincing to many, at least in terms of its basis in Akan practices, as it doesn't explain the differences in funeral practices for adults and infants. Gyekye claims these are simply because infants lack the money to fund a funeral and the relations to come to such event. However, this doesn't explain why parents are expected in the culture, at least according to Wiredu. Parents who just lost an infant are expected to be cheerful and not in mourning after the baby dies. So there's some concerns, but it's important to note that with ethnophilosophy, you don't need to get it perfectly right. If you have a completely, at least succinct and defensible position, even if that's not a perfect mapping onto of what the culture was saying, it still may be philosophically or logically defensible or justifiable. So we can look at the positions both on their own rights and on whether they're accurate representations of kind of the traditional beliefs of a community. Now, some concerns have been raised with respect to this view. One of them is the kind of individualistic, Western, arguably, concern that people have a right to care about just themselves and not have either their personhood, by Wiredu, or their virtue impinged by saying that, oh, you're not these things if you don't care for other people or work for others or aren't kind of a bit of a Samaritan. The Akan position in response might be a justification based on relationships, where certain relationships, being the child, the spouse, or the neighbor of someone, are what create those requirements. If you had no relationships with anyone, you might be excused to be individualistic. But because we all have those relationships, everyone's the child of someone, everyone's lives around other people, we have those responsibilities based on those relationships. It's not that individualism is uniquely bad, it's that because of your position within a community and society, you have those relationships and therefore have those responsibilities. Which is why, under these conceptions, an infant, at least talking about Wiredu, wouldn't have those things, because infants don't have those responsibilities to others. Infants don't have the ability to take care of others, and so they aren't required to fulfill those things, and so for Wiredu, they're not full people. Another concern might be that such a position does not allow for dissent within a community. Since your status as a person or a virtuous person is dependent on how others in the community view your contributions, there'd be no room for disagreeing with that consensus and proposing alternative moral standards. It's great to say that we want communal participation when everyone's building a barn or harvesting a field, but it's more concerning when everyone in the village is going to attack another village. If you say, well, I think that's morally wrong, I think we shouldn't kill people, and everyone says, you're not contributing to your communal responsibilities, so you're a bad person, you're not a full person, that might rub against our ideas about what being a good person really means. And you might say that, well, someone that steps outside of those bounds, they're not really a bad person. They're just questioning the moral standards. Now, Gyekye has argued that there's space for rational and reasoned dissent, and that the Akan might point to a range of dissenters in their history. However, if I were to take up a point with this position, it would certainly be this one. I'm particularly skeptical of this claim, as there are many communities which value relationships over well-reasoned arguments, and do in fact punish dissent everywhere in the world. And the dissenters presented in the history of the Akan to kind of contradict this claim rarely demonstrate complete apostasy from cultural teachings. Often it's just a slight change in direction. It's not stepping back and saying, whoa, what you're saying is completely wrong. By tying personhood to your perception by the community, there's a great danger for those who challenge, say, religious beliefs to be persecuted as bad people simply for questioning the will of the community. This, to me, is a big concern around tying personhood to your relationships with the community. As a skeptic myself, and someone that often feels alone within a philosophical community of dogmatists, this seems quite problematic if we would say that someone loses their personhood by not participating in a communal belief structure. And, in fact, gives often an excuse for oppression of, say, religious minorities. That was Akan Philosophical Psychology. Next up, we're going to be looking at Bantu philosophy, then Ethiopian philosophy, and finally Pan-Africanism. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.